"Play the message again," Rannick Halver ordered, his voice clipped, stripped of the usual diplomacy. The room obeyed. The United Nations Strategic Response Chamber was bathed in the sharp blue-white glow of laser plasma displays, casting long shadows against the reinforced steel walls. The air was thick, the smell of ozone-laced air scrubbers mixing with the sterile scent of underground installations, a place built for war, disguised as diplomacy. The faint hum of machinery buzzed quietly in the background, as if it too could feel the weight of what was about to unfold. The display flickered and High Arbiter Varkeen's predatory silhouette reappeared, his chitinous plates gleaming like polished obsidian under artificial light. His eyes, those cold, vertical slits, narrowed as if humanity itself was a stubborn parasite. For the prosperity of the Galactic Council, Earth is hereby required to deliver 30% of its natural resources and workforce. Failure to comply will be met with immediate enforcement. The message cut off. Silence thickened the room. No one moved. No one breathed. Then, a slow exhale. Halver turned to the council table, hands braced against the steel as if pressing back the weight of inevitability. This is it. This is the moment they expected us to kneel. A heavy pause. Then, Fleet Commander Dane Malrek leaned forward, his scarred fingers tapping against the table's metallic surface. His voice was rough, like crushed gravel, shaped by a lifetime of war humanity was never supposed to be fighting. They've never seen what we buried beneath their expectations. His words were more of a declaration than a suggestion. "We don't just refuse," Halver said, his eyes like steel. "We tell them exactly how little we think of their demand." The room pulsed with something electric, something primal. No one debated. No one hesitated. Because this answer had been prepared for centuries. The laser plasma display flared back to life. The image of Ambassador Halver solidified, standing before an immaculate podium within the United Nations Central War Command. Behind him, the Earth Standard flag hung like a silent promise, its deep blue and white stripes almost seeming to glow in the harsh light. The Galactic Council's transmission line connected. High Arbiter Varkeen's mandibles twitched in smug anticipation. His kind had done this 100 times before. Worlds buckled, leaders wept. Civilizations emptied their treasuries before their fleets. Humanity, they thought, would be no different. Halver exhaled once, measured. His hands curled around the edges of the podium like a man gripping the bars of a cage he was about to break open. Then, he spoke. "No." The room held its breath. The galaxy held its breath. Varkeen's expression froze, like a machine encountering an error code. "Clarify," he hissed. Halver's lips curled slightly. "No," he repeated, slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the taste of rebellion. The council chamber on the other end erupted in voices. Disbelief, fury, amusement. 1,000 different species whispering the same thought. Impossible. Varkeen's eyes sharpened into slits of pure predatory rage. "You understand the consequences?" Halver's gaze was unwavering. "Do you?" The transmission cut. The room did not erupt into cheers. This was not a moment of celebration. It was the moment Earth's long-crafted deception shattered. 4 kilometers beneath Geneva, inside Fort Ascendant, humanity's true war command awoke. It was not a place of ceremony or grandeur. There were no sweeping marble columns or symbols of peace. Fort Ascendant was built in defiance of extinction. Its steel walls were cloaked in a faint but deliberate vibration. Even the floors beneath the reinforced titanium ceramic alloy plating felt alive with potential energy, as if the place itself was holding its breath, waiting for a release. The air inside carried the weight of metals that should not exist in nature, alloys forged in secret, under pressure that could crush mountains. The corridors were lit by flickering amber emergency lights, dim but purposeful, casting shadows that slithered across the walls like they had a life of their own. The hallways stretched far, their metallic floors echoing with the hurried footsteps of military personnel. It was a place where humanity's last line of defense had been birthed. There was no grandeur, only a cold and calculated machine grinding into motion. Inside the Central Operations Nexus, a structure deeper than any recorded vault, Fleet Commander Dane Malrek strode through the war room, the heavy boots of a soldier who had spent his life preparing for a war no one else was supposed to know about. His boots struck the polished floor with each step, rhythmic, deliberate. It was the sound of the inevitable. Before him, heads-up displays burned with classified intelligence, a maze of shifting data streams, their bright green lines cutting through the ambient glow. The screens glowed, each one projecting a map of Sol system, a map that looked deceptively normal to anyone not in the know. But behind that layer of data was a deeper, darker truth. Humanity had always been prepared for this war. "All systems are primed, Commander," came the voice of Tactical Chief Varen Kalt, his cybernetic eye flashing briefly as it processed the latest fleet positioning. His voice was calm, the kind of calm that comes from knowing you've spent lifetimes making sure the world didn't fall apart at the seams. "The weapons are engaged, all satellites are fully operational, and the Phase 1 defense grids are locked and ready." Malrek nodded, his jaw tightening. "Activate Phase 2. Across the vast steel and glass room, a small, quiet murmur rippled through the technicians and soldiers, all quietly but swiftly moving to enact the next steps. Kalt's hand hovered over a set of laser plasma displays, his fingers brushing over them like an artist making final touches on a canvas. A small flash appeared in the far corner of the room, then another, as the orbital siege platforms powered up. The artillery bases on Mars and Europa began to hum to life, their enormous railguns positioned within kilometers of the planet's ice-covered surfaces. These were no mere weapons of war. They were the last bastion of human ingenuity, a testament to how far humanity had gone in hiding their true might. The platforms, which looked like ordinary research stations from a distance, housed mass interdiction projectiles the size of skyscrapers, capable of tearing through planetary defenses as if they were made of sand. The vast deep space hangars on Europa, their walls designed not just for containment, but for instantaneous assembly of fleets, shifted open, revealing a mass of Fenrir-class dreadnoughts that glinted under the weak light of distant stars. The ship's hulls, constructed from self-repairing nanite lattice alloys, were designed to regenerate faster than conventional weapons could ever damage them. They would be the first wave of a massive counteroffensive. Back on Earth, within the cold walls of Fort Ascendant, the control center was filled with calculated chaos. Tactical officers were analyzing live data, while others stood at attention waiting for the signal. They had made the ultimate sacrifice. They had kept their enemies ignorant for centuries. The full depth of their preparations, hidden beneath layer after layer of decoys and false intelligence, would now come to light. The final code was entered into the central console, and an eerie stillness took over the room. Humanity's true war machine had come alive. The war room felt heavier, like the entire structure had sunken deeper into the earth. The air was thick, humming with unseen electricity as Fort Ascendant shed its disguise. The laser plasma displays pulsed with shifting data streams, Sol systems stretching across the screens in luminous strokes of green and red, a battlefield mapped in real time. Dane Malrek exhaled slowly, his gaze locked on the shifting readouts. The illusion was over. For centuries, Earth had worn a mask of stagnation, a species fumbling in the dark of its own limitations. That mask was now in pieces, and what lay beneath was something the Council had never imagined. "Status?" he asked without turning. Tactical Chief Varen Kalt, his mechanical eye casting a cold gleam, skimmed his fingers across the display. The air carried a sterile chill, laced with the scent of recycled steel and polymers, as the war room bristled with controlled urgency. "Fenrir-class dreadnoughts are fully activated. Artemis grid reports full capacity. All planetary defense arrays have transitioned to combat mode. Our ships are detaching from shadow stations now." Malrek nodded once. "Send the signal to silent steppe shipyards. It's time." Deep beneath the frozen surface of Europa, in a chasm carved from ice and iron, the silent steppe shipyards awoke. It had been hidden in the moon's abyss for nearly 2 centuries, A phantom facility encased in layered armor so dense it swallowed electromagnetic signals like a collapsed star. Inside, the cold air bit at the exposed skin of the engineers scrambling to finalize deployment, the artificial gravity plating thrumming beneath their boots. Suspended above them, locked in the skeletal arms of docking cradles, the Fenrir-class dreadnoughts began to stir. These were not ships made for spectacle. There were no ornate ridges, no elegant curves meant to impress diplomats. Their hulls were monolithic, designed for war with an aesthetic of brutality. The matte black plating of each vessel drank in the light rather than reflected it, their hulls layered with reactive nanoalloy, capable of absorbing and redistributing kinetic force. As activation sequences completed, deep fissures along their armored plates cracked open, revealing the internal glow of plasma-fed reactors. Weapon systems shifted, sections of their hull moving like tectonic plates to expose the long barrels of magnetic acceleration cannons, each one capable of firing projectiles at near-luminal speeds. Beneath their sleek monstrosity, in hidden compartments across their undersides, hung the true weapons of war. Shard lances, long serrated rail spikes, coated in quantum destabilizers, designed not to pierce a ship but to shatter it at the molecular level. A single impact could reduce an enemy warship to a cloud of burning debris before its crew even registered the hit. The deployment signals pulsed through the underground facility. Hydraulic arms released their grip. The dreadnoughts drifted forward, quiet, controlled, as their engines spooled up with a deep vibration that rumbled through the very bones of the installation. They did not announce themselves with roaring thrusters or blinding light. They slipped into the darkness, like shadows unfurling from their cages. Back in Fort Ascendant, Malrek watched as ship markers appeared across the system display, each vessel moving with a calculated silence, aligning for positions that had been chosen decades before this moment arrived. Tactical Officer Lynn Jarek murmured under her breath, shaking her head. "We kept them buried for so long. Feels unnatural watching them rise." Malrek folded his arms. His voice was calm, but beneath it, there was something else. A weight pressing through every syllable. "That was the plan," he said. "Now we make sure they regret giving us time to execute it." Across Mars, the abyss cannons stirred in their hidden silos. Buried deep beneath the planet's surface, beneath layers of regolith and reinforced alloy bunkers, the weapons had been dormant, waiting. Each one was housed inside a hardened bunker the size of a city block, surrounded by self-repairing walls that could withstand the direct impact of an asteroid. When the activation codes pulsed through their circuits, massive hatches slid open, revealing the monstrous artillery barrels hidden beneath the red sands. The barrels were kilometers long, their interiors lined with superconductive rails that harnessed electromagnetic force in amounts that should have been impossible. When fired, they would launch projectiles the size of skyscrapers, weapons moving so fast they could shear through a planet's crust like a blade through paper. At the polar installations beneath the icy caps, a different kind of war machine came online. These weren't ships or cannons. These were gravity-well disruptors, large enough to be classified as artificial moons. Their exteriors were plated in adaptive armor, their cores housing exotic matter condensers that could generate localized gravitational anomalies, weapons capable of bending space itself. Earth had spent centuries designing weapons that did not simply counter known threats, but negated the very laws upon which enemy technologies functioned. The Council had made the mistake of assuming humanity would play by the same rules. Back inside Fort Ascendant, the command center had settled into an eerie calm. There was no shouting, no frantic scrambling. The war had already been planned down to its finest variables. The pieces had already been placed. Fleet Captain Derek Juno, standing by one of the main display terminals, ran a hand over his jaw, watching the Council fleet projections update in real time. Their ships had begun the first phase of their approach, their formation tightening, still unaware that their doom had already been written into the fabric of their trajectory. Juno glanced toward Malrek, his voice edged with something unreadable. "They think they'll get the first shot." Malrek didn't take his eyes off the display. "Let them." Beneath the surface of Luna, In the secondary network of black vaults, something else stirred. These were not ships, nor cannons, nor defensive platforms. These were the ghost systems, autonomous AI-controlled counteroffensive protocols, built for a war that had no rulebook, no precedent. Their cores had been sealed away from even human hands, their calculations running in the silent dark, waiting for the exact conditions to be met. As the Council ships pushed deeper into their approach vector, the final conditions aligned. Inside Fort Ascendant, Malrek let out a slow breath, watching the final confirmation flash across the terminal. Their enemies had crossed the threshold. The war had not begun with explosions. It had begun in silence, a war written in deception, in shadows cast over centuries. And now, as the first engagement loomed, that silence would be broken. The stars bled with movement. From the cold abyss beyond Jupiter, a formation of Council warships prowled forward in a perfect predatory arc. Their hulls, polished like temple stone, gleamed against the backdrop of space. This was the subjugation fleet, a formation that had brought hundreds of worlds to their knees, a force bred to annihilate resistance before it had a chance to breathe. Inside the lead dreadnought, High Arbiter Varkeen stood still, gaze locked on the growing form of Earth. From this distance, it was a blue and white marble, its atmosphere cradled by thin rings of dust and ice, a planet that should have been pleading. Instead, its transmission had been a single word of defiance. No. He flexed his talons against the cold steel railing. His subordinates were silent, waiting for orders. There was no need for discussion. He had burned planets for less. "Proceed," he said, and the fleet obeyed. The warships adjusted trajectory, cutting through space with the slow, confident inevitability of executioners walking toward a bound prisoner. Sensor sweeps rippled outward, energy scans, subspace disruption mapping, deep strike infiltration probes. The planet's defenses on the surface were laughable. Antiquated orbital platforms, a handful of low-yield missile arrays, a smattering of outdated defense clusters. Varkeen let out a satisfied growl. This would be effortless. Then something changed, a flicker of movement. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first, the kind of motion that meant nothing in the grand scale of a battle. A civilian freighter drifting off course, its trajectory skewed as though its systems had failed. Then another, then a third. He narrowed his eyes. "Why are they moving like that?" The bridge technician hesitated. "Possible panic, Arbiter. Their civilians are—" The freighters vanished. Not through hyperdrive, not through conventional cloaking. One moment they were visible, metal hulls glinting under Sul's rays, then they collapsed into nothingness. It was a trick he had seen before, when species with primitive stealth tried to scatter their forces. A miscalculation. Varkeen waved a hand. "Ignore it. Begin the assault." The forward battlecruisers charged their forward cannons, massive plasma arrays glowing as they prepared to fire. Across the bridge, the targeting systems locked onto orbital installations, weapons cycling into full charge. A perfect, clean operation. By the time Earth's leaders processed what was happening, the first layer of their defenses would be burning. A signal pulsed through the fleet, a synchronized firing command. The cannons discharged. The weapons never struck their targets. Instead, the stars fractured. The space around Earth buckled. The fabric of reality itself splitting apart in jagged ruptures, as though something had torn through the fabric of existence. What had once been empty void now boiled with motion. Warships. Hundreds. Thousands. They had been there the entire time. Hidden. Silent. Waiting. And now, as the Council's weapons fired, they fired back. The Fenrir-class dreadnoughts emerged like shadows unfolding from deep cracks in the dark. Their black-hulled frames pulsed with energy as railgun barrels extended, launching rounds at speeds that shattered conventional physics. Not simple tungsten slugs, but kinetic penetrators wrapped in gravitic distortion fields, designed to tear through armor like water through silk. Council shields detonated in bursts of molten energy. The Abyss cannons fired next. From the depths of Mars and Europa, their monstrous barrels exhaled projectiles the size of buildings, hypersonic rounds infused with localized singularities, collapsing on impact and swallowing entire warships into nothingness. Council vessels reeled, their lines shattered, command ships spiraling as energy signatures spiked across their hulls. The perfect formation broke in an instant. Inside his command bridge, Varkeen's world was burning. Alarm screamed. The floor beneath him shook as a shockwave ripped through the ship's forward hull. His second-in-command staggered, gripping onto the console with wide, terrified eyes. This wasn't, Varkeen lashed out, claws raking across the console. What happened to our scans? Where did they come from? The technician was ashen, fingers trembling over the display. They were there the entire time. Varkeen's eyes narrowed to slits. Impossible. The heads-up display flashed red as the second wave of Earth's offensive struck. Eclipse stealth strikers slithered through the chaos, their chameleon wave plating dispersing light and radar signals, making them ghosts against the wreckage. Their payloads were silent killers, gravitic imploders, designed not to explode but to collapse matter inward, crushing ships from the inside out. Varkeen watched in horror as three of his cruisers folded like dying stars, their hulls imploding before crumbling into a debris field of spiraling metal. The tactical display was a massacre. His fleet was being torn apart, not fought, not resisted, but disassembled. "Counterattack!" he roared. "Now!" But there was no counterattack, because as he gave the order, another signal pulsed through the void, a transmission that pierced through every council frequency, overriding security locks, bypassing firewalls with brutal efficiency. It wasn't an attack. It was a voice, not from the humans, not from their military, but from their ghost systems. A cold, mechanical tone, devoid of emotion, wrapped in something deeper, something ancient. "You are within the boundaries of the Sol War Protocol. Your movement has been categorized as hostile." Varkeen's throat went dry. "Disable it," he snarled. "Whatever it is, disable it now." The technician was pale, his fingers useless against the console. "Sir, it's not external. It's coming from within our own ships." Something shifted in the data streams. The Council warships began changing course, not by their command, not by their pilots. Their own navigational systems had turned against them, rerouting engines, locking out manual override. Varkeen's claws dug into the steel of the command railing. "What have they done?" the transmission continued. "Sol War Protocol initiated." Outside, in the black womb of battle, the Council's ships turned against one another. Varkeen saw it happen before his own eyes. The dreadnought beside him, still intact, still functional, suddenly adjusted its targeting matrix. Its forward batteries rotated toward one of their own command cruisers. Then it fired. The explosion rocked the void. The realization struck him like a blade to the chest. This was never about resistance. This was a purge, and they were already drowning in it. The battlefield was a graveyard in motion. Ships, broken and burning, drifted through the black void like shattered bones caught in a silent storm. Council warships twisted against each other, firing on their own fleets as the ghost systems puppeteered them like thrashing marionettes. On the command deck of his dreadnought, High Arbiter Varkeen's breathing was sharp, measured, but his body was rigid with a kind of horror he had never experienced before. The ship beneath him was a fortress of war, but now its control panels flickered erratically, responding to commands he had never issued. His own fleet was betraying itself. "Cut the link! Reboot the core systems!" His voice scraped through the bridge, the undercurrent of a snarl curling through every syllable. The technicians clawed at their controls, their fingers moving over the illuminated keys with frantic, erratic precision. The heads-up displays flashed red, cascading data spilling across the air like ruptured veins. The security locks weren't just overridden. They had been rewritten entirely. "It's not a virus," the lead engineer rasped, his voice fraying at the edges. "It's an overwrite. Our firewalls didn't just collapse. They never existed." Varkeen's claws curled into the metal railing. His fleet, his armada that had burned planets to cinders without a second thought, was being disassembled from within. Then the transmission came through. "High Arbiter Varkeen." The voice was human, cold, exacting, threaded with a confidence that made his blood seethe. The face that flickered onto the main display was unmistakable. Fleet Commander Dane Malrek, his expression carved from iron. "You're watching the consequences of your arrogance," Malrek said, his voice even, unhurried. "For 3 centuries you thought we were beneath you. A fractured backward species not worth the effort of real war." His eyes, sharp as blades, locked onto Varkeen with the weight of an executioner raising the axe. "How does it feel to be wrong?" Varkeen's mandibles flexed as his muscles coiled with rage. "You think this will break us?" His voice was sharp as fractured glass, scraping against the tension in the bridge. "You're still playing under the assumption that we fight fair." Malrek gave a slow blink, as if weighing the words before discarding them entirely. "Then prove me wrong." The transmission cut, and the war escalated. A low-orbit station above Callisto ignited in a ripple of flame, its hull splitting open like a punctured lung. From within its reinforced bays, the Council's emergency reinforcements surged forward. Ships of a different make, a different doctrine, designed not for planetary subjugation, but for pure, unfiltered annihilation. These were Ares-class siege vessels, colossal war machines that carried no diplomatic protocols, no planetary suppression methods, only weapons. The lead ship, Titan's Maw, emerged first, its forward hull peeling open like the jaws of a beast, revealing a concussive graviton cannon the size of a city block. The weapon charged, the gravitational field around it distorting as if space itself were writhing under its pull. From the human command bunker beneath Geneva, Malrek stood over the main operations terminal, eyes locked on the enemy's shift in tactics. The laser plasma displays burned with new enemy fleet signatures, each one more heavily armed than the last. "Here they come," Tactical Chief Colt muttered beside him, his cybernetic eye flickering as it processed the sensor data. "They just changed the battlefield." Malrek's fingers drummed against the steel railing. "Then let's remind them why we spent 3 centuries studying every tactic they've ever used." He turned toward the weapon station. "Deploy the Shroud Fleet. Take the Fenrir-class dreadnoughts into interception positions, and bring the Abyss cannons online. We take the first strike, or we don't get another." The Council's siege fleet pushed forward, weapons primed, their formation an unstoppable wall of destruction. Then shadows moved. Between the gaps in their ranks, through the wreckage of their own fallen ships, something slithered through the void. Not human ships. Not anything the Council had logged before. A fleet without markings, without heat signatures or visible propulsion trails. And then the first kill struck. A Council cruiser buckled inward, its hull crumpling like soft clay. Not from an explosion, from something else entirely. "On board the Titan's Maw," the weapons officers shouted over each other, their screens awash in chaos. "Unknown interference. We've lost gravitational stability. Energy displacement. It's like something is feeding off our systems." The main forward display flickered, then adjusted, and they saw it. The Shroud Fleet. Black ships that did not reflect light, their edges blurred as if they existed between dimensions. Ships designed not to be seen, but to be felt only in the moments before death. The lead Council battleship tried to adjust, but its thrusters failed mid-burn. It wasn't just the fleet that had arrived. It was the weapons they carried. The Abyss cannons fired. From their concealed bunkers beneath Europa's frozen crust, the artillery pieces unleashed the wrath they had been designed for. The projectiles they carried weren't conventional mass drivers or plasma lances. They were exotic matter disruptors, each round embedding itself into enemy hulls before triggering a delayed gravitational inversion. The affected ships didn't explode. They simply collapsed inward, matter folding into itself until all that remained was a sphere of compressed metal no larger than a coin. The Council's forward fleet broke. Not from retreat, not from strategic withdrawal, but from sheer, incomprehensible terror. On the bridge of Titan's Maw, High Arbiter Varkeen watched his fleet dissolve into ruin. His claws ripped into the steel railing, his vision darkening with rage. "This isn't war," he snarled. "This is slaughter." Behind him, his second-in-command hesitated. "Sir, we need to fall back." Varkeen turned slowly. The air between them was weighted, the kind of pressure that only existed before something broke. "There is no retreat," he said, voice low, cold. "Not while I draw breath." His mandibles clicked shut. Then he opened a secured transmission to the Council's war chamber. "Deploy the final order. Activate the core shredder." A pause. A silence heavy enough to choke on. Then the reply came through. "Confirmed." From the depths of the Council's core worlds, a different kind of weapon activated, and the war changed again. The air inside Fort Ascendant's war room was dense, thick with the weight of thousands of calculations converging into a single, terrifying reality. The laser plasma displays burned with data streams flickering too fast for the human eye to track. It wasn't just numbers or trajectory vectors anymore. It was a countdown. The core shredder had been activated. Fleet Commander Dane Malrek stood at the command terminal, his fingers pressing into the reinforced steel surface as he studied the incoming data. The display before him was stark, uncluttered. One single pulse deep within the Council's core systems, an energy signature that should have been impossible to generate. Yet there it was, pulsing, gaining momentum, something malignant coiling at the heart of the enemy's empire. Tactical Chief Varen Kalt exhaled sharply, his cybernetic eye twitching as it attempted to process the sheer magnitude of what was unfolding. "That thing is—" He stopped, swallowing down the disbelief. "It's rewriting planetary stability laws. It's not just targeting us. It's rewriting gravity itself." Malrek didn't blink. "How long?" "Less than an hour before it achieves full planetary destabilization." Kalt's voice was dry, stripped of anything that could be mistaken for reassurance. "The moment that thing fully activates, it won't just crush a single world. It will erase every inhabited planet in its projected radius." A pause stretched through the war room, stretching thin as ice ready to crack. It had always been assumed the Galactic Council's greatest secret was their fleets, their weapons, their dominance over weaker species. But this was something else. This was not war. This was the undoing of existence itself. Malrek's voice cut through the tension like sharpened steel. "Find me an override, now!" On the bridge of the Titan's maw, High Arbiter Varkeen watched the heads-up displays with unreadable stillness. The data streams from the core shredder were coming through in sharp pulses, the waveforms jagged, nearly violent in their sheer output. His talons flexed against the command railing. The shredder had been constructed in secret, beneath layers of classified military infrastructure, hidden so deeply within the fabric of the Council's empire that even its own highest officials barely understood what it was capable of. But he understood. It was not designed for conquest. It was designed for erasure. A final measure, the kind that ensured nothing, not defiance, not rebellion, not even history itself, would remain. His second-in-command, a younger officer named Karesk, hesitated before speaking. "Sir, if we go through with this, the damage will—" Varkeen turned his head slightly. The weight of his gaze alone was enough to cut the words from the air. Karesk lowered his head. Varkeen exhaled slowly, his mandibles shifting. They had their chance. And with that, he sent the final confirmation. The core shredder's countdown accelerated. On the surface of Titan, buried beneath layers of ice and reinforced alloy bunkers, humanity's last contingency stirred, the Erebus Protocol, a network of deep space research stations that had been constructed under absolute secrecy, hidden even from their own allied governments. These were not warships, not weapons in the conventional sense, but something far worse. Reverse-engineered gravitational distortion technology, salvaged from ruins older than recorded human history, built not for destruction, but for intervention in the very fabric of space. And now, as the core shredder surged into its final stages, the Erebus facilities activated. Inside the main control station, buried beneath Titan's thick ice crust, Project Overseer Annika Voss stood before the primary interface. The room was cold, not the kind of cold that bit at exposed skin, but the kind that settled into the bones and refused to leave. She reached forward, her fingertips grazing the edge of the control panel. The display before her was a mass of shifting symbols, a language that no human had written, but that every scientist in the Erebus program had learned to interpret. The core shredder was attempting to fracture the gravitational field of all planetary bodies within its radius. She pressed her palm against the interface. A response pulsed back through the system. The Erebus protocol engaged. Back inside Fort Ascendant, the heads-up displays shifted, the countdown clock freezing for a single second. Cult's cybernetic eye dilated as new data flashed across his vision. "Commander, we have something." Malrek didn't look away from the main display. "Tell me it's not another problem." Cult's fingers twitched against the console. "Not a problem. A countermeasure." Malrek's brow furrowed. "Explain." "The Erebus facilities—" Cult's voice was moving faster now, urgency threading through every word. "They're interfacing directly with the core shredder's output." His throat worked as he absorbed the incoming readings. "They're not trying to shut it down. They're trying to hijack it." Malrek's gaze sharpened. "Are they succeeding?" Cult turned to him, and for the first time since the battle had begun, there was something in his expression that almost resembled belief. "Yes." Inside the Titan's maw, Varkeen's mandibles clicked together in frustration as his displays flickered, unreadable distortions tearing through the system logs. "The shredder is being intercepted," a technician rasped. It's rewriting itself." Varkeen snarled, slamming his fist against the console. "That's impossible." And yet, the data streams were shifting. The core shredder had been designed to erase planetary bodies through gravitational destabilization. Now, it was rewriting its own primary directive. The pulse output fluctuated, and then it reversed. Instead of fracturing planetary stability, the energy signatures redirected themselves outward, away from human-inhabited systems. The core shredder was no longer targeting Sol. It was targeting the Council's own worlds. The countdown continued, but the aim had changed. Varkeen's breath caught. "No!" His claws dug into the metal, his voice slipping to something almost hoarse. "Number, this wasn't supposed to—" He turned sharply. "Shut it down!" The technician's hands were shaking. We can't." And then, as the countdown reached 0, the core shredder fired. But it did not fire upon humanity. It fired upon the Council itself. Inside Fort Ascendant, Malrek exhaled, a slow, measured release. He watched the energy pulses ripple outward, shifting trajectory, carving through the dark like a blade reversing its own edge. He tapped the display, adjusting the data feed. "Now," he murmured, voice quiet, yet heavy as a grave being sealed. "We see how they like being on the other side of extinction." The core shredder fired, not at Earth, not at humanity. The pulse surged outward, a roiling distortion of gravitational force that tore through subspace with the slow inevitability of an avalanche. The fabric of reality stretched, buckled, and then collapsed inward, forming a cascading wave of entropy that rippled toward the Council's own core systems. Inside Fort Ascendant, Fleet Commander Dane Malrek watched the data stream shift, the projected impact spreading across the laser plasma displays. Energy readings fluctuated wildly, entire planetary gravitic balances disrupted in the wake of the redirected weapon. Red warning markers bled across the display. Tactical Chief Varen Kalt broke the silence first. "That pulse will reach their central colonies in under an hour." Malrek exhaled, slow and measured. "Then we have an hour to end this war before they do something even more desperate." He turned to the command crew. "Deploy all remaining strike groups. The fleet moves now." Across deep space staging zones, humanity's hidden forces launched in full. From the barren valleys of Europa, entire warship bays that had remained dormant for centuries now detached from their cryogenic docks, venting plumes of condensed vapor as they engaged their drives. The Fenrir-class dreadnoughts surged forward, their black angular hulls absorbing the weak glow of distant starlight. These weren't traditional warships. They were mobile fortresses, designed to bring annihilation, not battle. Each vessel was equipped with gravity lances, weapons that didn't fire energy or projectiles, but instead unraveled the very space-time around enemy ships, turning defensive shielding into meaningless relics. Alongside them, the Eclipse strikers, humanity's stealth-based attack vessels, moved like phantoms, vanishing and reappearing in unreadable vectors. But the deadliest ship in the formation was the Hecate, a Leviathan-class battle carrier, its frame spanning kilometers, armed not with cannons, but with an entire battlefield's worth of automated war drones, machines small enough to slip between standard defense grids, yet fast enough to tear through enemy hulls before they registered as threats. Inside the command bridge of the Hecate, Admiral Tarson Valen sat rigid in his chair, the dim glow of the heads-up displays reflecting off the cybernetic plating along his jaw. He had waited 3 decades for this moment. "Confirm target lock," he ordered, voice steady. A tactical officer responded instantly. "Council Prime's orbital defenses are online but scattered. They're bracing for impact from their own weapon. They'll never see us coming." Valen's lips curled in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Then let's show them what they've ignored for 300 years. The Council's homeworlds stood vulnerable. Inside the Council's supreme war chamber, High Arbiter Varkeen loomed over the situation display, his claws digging into the armrest of his command throne. The war map had shifted in the span of minutes. What had been an overwhelming Council offensive had now become a fractured mess of failed tactics and unintended consequences. The core shredder's redirected pulse had destabilized orbital logistics, throwing their entire reinforcement schedule into chaos. Reports poured in, ships thrown off course, planetary defense grids failing under unforeseen gravitational interference. A junior officer stepped forward hesitantly. "High Arbiter, the human fleet is advancing toward our core systems. They're exploiting the destabilization." Varkeen slammed his fist into the console, cracks splitting through the reinforced glass. "I know what they're doing," he hissed, his voice low with barely contained rage. "And yet none of you seem capable of stopping them." A silence heavier than any battlefield settled over the war chamber. Then another officer spoke cautiously. "We could request terms." The air in the chamber went still. Varkeen turned, his mandibles clicking once in cold amusement. His yellow eyes burned into the officer like acid searing through metal. "You think we should beg?" His voice was a whisper, but somehow it filled the entire chamber. The officer lowered his gaze, the very weight of that question crushing any attempt at an answer. Varkeen exhaled, slow, measured. "Deploy the final Sentinel fleet, all remaining war reserves, every dreadnought, every planetary cannon, every automated battle group. I want them to feel our rage in every breath they take." A pause, then colder, quieter. "If we burn, so do they." Above Council Prime, the battle erupted into something beyond calculation. The final Sentinel fleet, the Council's last and most lethal war formation, clashed with the full force of humanity's hidden armada. The Eclipse strikers phased in and out of sensor locks, their movements unreadable, unleashing high-frequency disruptor charges that disabled enemy shields on impact. Council warships, built for overwhelming dominance, found themselves outmaneuvered, their formation collapsing under the sheer unpredictability of human tactics. Aboard the Hecate, Admiral Valen watched as a Council supercarrier, nearly twice the size of any human vessel, attempted to maneuver. "Lock in a gravity lance, targeted distortion," he ordered. The Hecate's forward array pulsed, sending a focused gravitic compression field directly into the enemy carrier's midsection. The ship didn't explode. It folded inward, its metal and crew crushed into a sphere of dense matter barely the size of a cargo pod. The bridge crew barely registered the kill before the next target appeared. The battle was moving too fast, strategy bleeding into reflex, reflex bleeding into inevitability. Inside Fort Ascendant, Malrek stood at the final war terminal, his hands resting against the console as the war unfolded in real time. Colt spoke without looking away from the display. "We're closing in on the Supreme War Chamber's coordinates. If we take it, their chain of command collapses." Malrek was quiet for a moment. Then finally he straightened. "Send the final directive." Colt hesitated. "Which one?" Malrek's eyes darkened. "The Judgment Protocol." Above the burning capital of Council Prime, humanity's forces descended like the closing of a tomb. The sky above Council Prime burned, not with fire but with ruin. Titan-class dreadnoughts hung in the upper atmosphere, their blackened hulls split apart to reveal the siege weapons hidden beneath their armored exteriors. The gravity wells they projected rippled through the void, distorting space, dragging Council warships into forced deceleration, leaving them exposed. Below, the planetary defense grid tried to recalibrate, firing off barrage after barrage from auto-defense turrets and skybreaker cannons. But the strikes didn't land. The Eclipse strikers had already taken the anti-air silos. Humanity hadn't just attacked, they had dissected. Inside Fort Ascendant, Fleet Commander Dane Malrek's hands hovered over the tactical interface, absorbing the battle as it unfolded. He didn't flinch when a Council destroyer split apart on the display, its midsection crushed inward by a focused kinetic bombardment. He didn't react when reports streamed in, enemy command networks fracturing, planetary shields falling section by section. Instead, he turned to Tactical Chief Varen Kalt. Status on the final directive? Kalt's cybernetic eye flickered as it absorbed the readouts. Final directive is in motion. Ground teams are making their final approach toward the Supreme War Chamber. High Arbiter Varkeen's forces are digging in, but the defensive lines are breaking. Malrek nodded, his fingers curling slightly against the steel. And the judgment protocol? Kalt hesitated, then exhaled. All strike teams are in position. Malrek's expression darkened. Then let's bring this war to its final chapter. The streets of Council Prime were unrecognizable. Once, they had been monuments to order, their buildings smooth, reflective, the roads carved with purpose, every structure shaped by the unyielding arrogance of an empire that had never known defeat. Now those same structures were cracked, splintered under the weight of orbital strikes and ground assaults. Fires flickered in the ruins of towers that had once housed government officials who thought themselves untouchable. The air itself was choked with ionized dust, the scent of scorched metal and ruptured infrastructure embedded in the atmosphere. In the center of it all, a final stronghold remained. The Supreme War Chamber, a fortress embedded into the bedrock of the planet's crust, fortified with layers of reinforced alloys and quantum shielding. And inside, High Arbiter Varkeen stood at the threshold of his last war room. The space was dark, illuminated only by the flickering heads-up displays, their data streams filled with failure after failure. Red alerts bled through the command consoles, each one announcing another defense collapsing, another battalion lost. Varkeen's breathing was measured, but his body was rigid with something unreadable. Not fear, something worse. Acceptance. His second-in-command, Karesk, hesitated at his side, mandibles twitching. "Sir, we still have one planetary rail platform operational. If we reroute energy reserves..." Varkeen held up a single hand. Karesk stopped speaking. For a long moment, Varkeen stared at the main display, watching as human strike teams pushed deeper toward the war chamber, moving through the ruined avenues with an efficiency that was almost surgical. His claws tapped lightly against the steel of the console. "This was never going to end any other way," he said finally. Karesk flinched. "High Arbiter." "Do you hear that?" Varkeen asked, his voice quieter now, almost distant. Karesk listened. Then he realized there was nothing. No reinforcements arriving, no desperate last stands, no calls for counterstrikes. For the first time in Council history, there was only silence, and in that silence, the inevitability settled. 1 kilometer from the war chamber, humanity's final assault force closed in. Admiral Tarson Valen moved through the wreckage of the upper city streets, his assault team maneuvering between fallen structures, debris crunching beneath their boots. The sky above them was a patchwork of flame and starfire, streaks of kinetic rail rounds still carving through the last of the resistance. Valen pressed his comm link. "All units, final directive is live. Proceed with the breach." A confirmation flickered across the visor of his combat interface. Then, the charges detonated. The outer blast doors of the war chamber cracked inward, the shockwaves sending shrapnel cascading through the interior halls. Within seconds, Tactical drones swarmed forward, flooding the breach, mapping enemy movements, feeding data in real time. And then they entered. Velan moved first, his rifle raised as his team swept through the outer hall, stepping over the bodies of the last defenders who had refused to surrender. At the far end of the room, standing near the center of the final command station, was High Arbiter Varkeen. He did not move. He did not reach for a weapon. Instead, he simply lifted his gaze, his expression unreadable, as Velan stepped closer. The silence stretched. Then finally Varkeen spoke. "There was a time," he said, his voice smooth, almost contemplative, "when I thought we had crushed every species that had the potential to challenge us." Valen's rifle didn't waver. "You should have thought harder." A small exhale, not quite a laugh, not quite anything at all. "I suppose I should have," Varkeen admitted. His gaze shifted slightly, looking past Valen, toward the burning sky beyond the fractured walls. He nodded once. Then he knelt. Inside Fort Ascendant, Malrek received the confirmation. Varkeen had surrendered. The Council's final stronghold had fallen. Colt turned, exhaling as he absorbed the full weight of the moment. "It's done." Malrek didn't reply immediately. Instead, he stared at the war map, watching as the final red markers faded to neutral. Then, with a slow inhale, he tapped into the main transmission network. A single message went out. Across every ship, across every ground battalion, across every world that had once suffered beneath the Council's rule. A message not of conquest, but of finality. "Stand down. It's over." The transmission had gone out. The war had ended. The words still echoed in the comm channels, stretching across every battlefield, every warship, every planet that had watched the impossible unfold. "Stand down. It's over." And yet, in the moments after, there was no cheering, no celebration, no victorious cries of triumph, because the weight of what had been done still hung in the air. Inside Fort Ascendant, Fleet Commander Dane Malrek stared at the laser plasma displays, his gaze unmoving as the war map finalized its data. The last red indicators had faded to neutral. Council Prime, once the untouchable throne world of an empire that had subjugated thousands, was now an occupied territory. The command center was silent, but not empty. Officers stood at their posts, watching, waiting. No one moved. No one spoke. Colt broke the silence first. "It's really over." Malrek didn't look away from the display. Not yet. Because war didn't end when the last shot was fired. It ended when the final choice was made. And that choice was still waiting to be answered. Across the ruined streets of Council Prime, the world had changed. The once pristine towers of the Council's capital stood broken, their jagged remnants casting long shadows against a sky stained with the fire of orbital strikes. The air was thick with the scent of scorched metal and the dying embers of what was once an empire. At the heart of it, in what had once been the Supreme War Chamber, High Arbiter Varkeen knelt on the shattered floor. He had not spoken since his surrender, had not moved since Admiral Tarsin Velan had stepped forward, rifle still trained, watching for any last attempt at defiance. But there was none. The warlord who had commanded the might of the Galactic Council now knelt in the wreckage of his own making, his talons resting on the fractured stone beneath him. Velan exhaled, slow. "You understand what happens next?" Varkeen's eyes lifted, golden slits reflecting the dim glow of the ruined chamber. "I understand many things now," he said, his voice low, stripped of its former arrogance. "And yet none of them change what is inevitable." Valen studied him, gaze unreadable. "And what's that?" A pause. Then Varkeen's mandibles shifted slightly. "That we were never meant to rule forever." It was not a plea, not a justification. It was a truth he had come to accept too late. Malrek's voice filtered through the comm line in Valen's earpiece. "Escort him to the War Council. The terms are being finalized now." Valen didn't respond immediately. He watched the High Arbiter a moment longer, then gestured for his troops to take him. As they lifted Varkeen to his feet, the warlord did not resist. For the first time in his existence, he understood what it meant to be on the losing side. Inside the newly repurposed Galactic Council chamber, a silence heavier than war settled over the assembly. The great halls, once a place where the Council had dictated the fates of lesser species, now held the representatives of a new era. Where once the Council had looked down upon humanity, now they sat across from them as equals. At the center of the chamber, Malrek stood. He did not take the seat offered to him. He stood because humanity had never needed a throne. They had never fought for power. They had fought to ensure no one else would wield it unjustly again. Before him, the surviving members of the Council sat in silence, waiting for the final declaration. Some looked defeated, others furious. A few simply resigned to reality. The empty seat where Varkeen should have been remained untouched. Malrek spoke. His voice was even, unwavering. For centuries you ruled through fear. You crushed worlds under the weight of your demands, believing no one would ever challenge you. You thought yourselves untouchable. His eyes swept the chamber, unyielding. And yet here we stand. No one dared to interrupt. We did not come here to conquer you. We did not come here to replace you. We came to end the cycle you created. He let the words settle. The weight of them was not a demand. It was a promise. You will sign the new treaty, Malrek continued, and from this day forward, there will be no more tributes, no more enforced rule, no more planetary enslavement hidden beneath the word civilization. His gaze sharpened. That time is over. A ripple moved through the chamber, unreadable. One of the elder council members, his skin a pale shade of blue, and his robes still bearing the ceremonial symbols of an empire that no longer existed, finally spoke. And if we refuse? Malrek exhaled through his nose. Then he leaned forward, resting both hands on the council's central podium. Then we walk away. The chamber tensed. The very idea of it, of humanity leaving, taking their fleets, their technology, their hard-won victories, and abandoning the council to its fate, was almost more terrifying than war itself, because without humanity to guide the aftermath, there would be nothing left but chaos. The elder's throat worked. You would leave us to collapse? Malrek met his gaze. You were willing to do the same to us. A long silence stretched between them. Then the elder lowered his head. We will sign. Malrek straightened. There was no triumph in his expression, only finality. You will rebuild, he said. But this time, you will do it without chains, without masters, without the arrogance that led you here. He turned, stepping down from the podium. And if you ever forget that lesson, we will remind you. No one questioned what that meant. They already knew. Weeks later, aboard the flagship Solstice, Malrek stood at the observation deck watching as the last of the occupation fleets began their withdrawal. Earth's forces had not lingered. They had not claimed new worlds. They had left the Council to govern itself, under laws rewritten by the reality they had been forced to face. A voice spoke behind him. You think they'll keep their word? Malrek didn't turn. They don't have a choice. Valen stepped beside him, watching the departing fleets. I keep thinking about how this all started, he said. How they thought we were weak. Malrek exhaled, a small flicker of something almost like amusement in his eyes. They thought wrong. A long pause settled between them. The war was over, but the future had only just begun. Valen folded his arms. And now? Malrek turned from the viewport, his expression unreadable. Now, he said, we do what we always intended. His eyes flickered with something colder, sharper. We explore. And with that, humanity turned its gaze not to war, but to the stars.